Okay, so I am Dr. Jorge de Lohan. Okay, so usually when we do these presentations, in front of like medical staff or, for academic purposes, we always say that, whether we have disclosures or not, so I don't have any financial disclosures to, you can hear that, right? Okay. Now, what I want to do today is I want to go over a few points, okay? One is the history of e-cigarettes and vaping. It's going to be very important to kind of realize this, that there is a subtle kind of undercurrent there, a marketing ploy, so to speak. Then we need to know about the epidemiology. Okay, we're talking about vaping, but who does vaping really affect, all right? We're going to describe e-cigarettes and vaping products. We're going to look at their schematics. What does a unit look like? And the constituents of the products that are used for vaping. We're also going to talk about E-Valley, okay, which is vaping-associated lung injury, as well as injuries from the actual device explosions. So first, a little history. If you don't know, e-cigarettes first entered into the market around in the early 2000s. In 2003, it entered the China market, and in 2006, it actually entered into the United States and to Europe. It entered the markets without government regulation. Now, I think it's very important to understand that we're talking about inhaling a substance into your body, and no one is regulating what this is, okay? It was only until 2016 that the FDA had authority to cover e-cigarettes. That's almost, 10 years after they entered the United States before the FDA got on board. Okay, so this is actually a very interesting piece of information. These were, the vaping devices and the solutions were first produced by small companies. These small companies all were later acquired by tobacco companies. So just to give you some names, for example, most people are familiar with the Juul device, okay, and Altria. These two organizations were bought by Philip Morris International. Zendera, which makes e-lights and Logic, was bought up by Japan Tobacco International. Dragonite, which produces J and the Blue device, that was later bought up by Imperial Tobacco. What's interesting to note is that Dragonite was owned by Han Lik, who is a Chinese pharmacist who claims to have invented the e-cigarette. And finally, CN Creative and Nico Ventures were acquired by British American Tobacco and R.J. Reynolds. And they produce the Vape and the Vuse devices. So one thing that we have to remember is that the e-cigarette and the vaping devices were originally used as, or were thought to be methods by which we could wean patients off cigarettes. And we'll talk about the history of the tobacco industry in the next couple slides. But it's important to remember that because that's not actually how it's working out these days, all right? Now, between 2014 and 2018, the value of the global e-cigarette market more than doubled, from $6.8 billion to over $15.7 billion, and it's probably more now. In 2019, it was $20.2 billion. Again, the vaping and e-cigarettes were meant to kind of transition a cigarette smoker from using that tobacco product to e-cigarettes and vaping. So it was meant as a way for smoking cessation, which as a physician, I think that's a wonderful idea, right? What's interesting to know is that in adults in 2018 to 2019, the prevalence or the use of vaping increased from 7.6 to 9.3. Now, how would you interpret that? You could say that, well, more people are moving over to vaping now, that must mean that they're coming off the cigarettes, which are the carcinogens, right? Well, in the youth, in 2019, the prevalence of vaping use among high school students was 27.5%. And in middle school, it was 10.5%. And some of these studies specifically say that these numbers are probably underrepresented due to the fact of the terminology that is used for all these e-cigarette and vaping products. So just to wrap your head around this again one more time, adults went to using vaping at 9.3%. the percentage of high school students and middle school students exceeded the number of adults using vaping products. So this is kind of like a graphical representation of this, okay? And what's important to see is that the red line and the black line, okay, represent e-cigarette use and tobacco use. Black is tobacco, okay, and red is e-cigarette. Again, what's frightening to see is that if you think that e-cigarettes are a way to transition from cigarettes, that's not what's happening here. Actually, the rates of cigarette use and the rates of vaping are both going up. We had an interesting conversation up here in the front earlier, and I remember going to middle school, and the only thing I had to do was pack my backpack, my pencil pouch, my notebooks, and my books, and go to school. You know, I would never think that anyone in middle school would even be smoking or vaping. Well, if you look here, the rates of vaping and even using any tobacco product, which is even like chewing tobacco, was also increasing in 2019. Now, what is vaping and what are the devices and how do they work, okay? So, in general, they're called ENDS, and electronic nicotine delivery systems. And this involves a cartridge containing liquid, okay, connected to an atomizer. That atomizer has a vaporization chamber and a heating element. So that's what heats up the juice, okay, that one would put into the vaping pen, okay, or the e-cigarette, all right, and aerosolizes it. There also, of course, is a battery, because you need to have some form of energy. Now, the designs are varied, okay? You can have tanks and mods. You can have rechargeable e-cigarettes. Some can be even recharged on your USB port, all right? And there's a disposable e-cigarette, all right? We have some examples here at the bottom. This is the Juul device on the left, the Mark 10 Elite in the center, and the Pax Era on the right. Now, what's particularly insidious, and I do say this, is that when they market the materials that are used for the e-cigarettes and the vape pens, they look like candy. I saw this picture and I'm like, oh, this is candy. And they come in all kinds of flavors. I mean, citrus flavors, mango, bubble gum, cotton candy, you know? And then you start to ask yourself the question, who exactly is the target audience for all of this? I mean, you look at some of these, some of these ads that are out in, various forms of media. This doesn't look like something that you would use for a transition for a harmful substance to something less harmful. It seems like this is something that you would want to get. Now, I have to show my age. I'm actually 54 years old. I'll be 55 in June. Okay? And some of you are laughing when you see this picture. Because you're like, man, that's James Dean. So, for those who don't know who James Dean was, I mean, James Dean was he was a teen idol because he kind of epitomized, during that period in the 1950s, of what it would be to be, a man, right? So, he's got the clothes, he's got the car, he just looks cool, and he smokes a cigarette, all right? And those of us who grew up in that, in the eras following kind of know how smoking created an image for people. Well, this is a Juul ad. She looks cool, right? She looks like she's in the in crowd, right? She looks sophisticated, and she also smokes, but she's not smoking a cigarette. Okay, she's smoking an e-cigarette. So, again, you ask yourself the question, to whom are these products being marketed to? So let's talk about the tobacco industry, because I think that if you see the development of cigarettes, one better understands why this is a paradigm that is being repeated. So cigarettes were first introduced into the United States in the 19th century. Okay, before this, most tobacco was in pipes and cigars, or chewing, or in snuff. By the time of the Civil War, cigarette use had become more popular, and a federal tax was first imposed on cigarettes in 1864. And after that, the development of the cigarette manufacturing industry led to their quickly becoming a major US tobacco product. Now, at the same time, there was a populist health reform movement, and it's very interesting what happened here, because they actually didn't like smoking. They thought that it was immoral and unhygienic. So what happens is the industry has now decided, well, there has to be a better way to make this cigarette product more appealing. So what they did is they used a milder, flue-cured tobacco blend, all right? This makes the smoke easier to inhale and increase the nicotine absorption in the bloodstream. Now, despite what everyone thinks, nicotine is highly addicting, okay? In fact, in World War I, the Army surgeons praised cigarettes for actually helping the wounded by relaxing and easing their pain. And they included them in, I'm probably, again, dating myself, what they called K rations. They would actually pack the cigarettes in the soldiers' meals. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, smoking was now being linked to lung cancer. In 1956, the Surgeon General actually says that there is a causal relationship between excessive cigarette smoking and lung cancer. So mind you, this is 1956. In 1962, the Royal College of Physicians in England emphasized smoking's causative role in lung cancers. Now you got both sides of the Atlantic Ocean saying that smoking is linked to lung cancer. So the anti-smoking messages had a significant impact on cigarette sales. However, when the television and radio banned the advertising in 1969, the anti-smoking messages were also discontinued. And in 1972, the Surgeon General became the first of a series of science-based reports that identify environmental tobacco smoke, also known as ETS, as a health risk to non-smokers. So if you smoke, you're harming the people around you. So now things start falling down to the states, okay? In 1973, Arizona becomes the first state to restrict smoking in public places, just because of the ETS exposure. In the 1970s, the federal government began regulating smoking within government domains. And in 1975, the Army and Navy stopped including the cigarettes in the K rations. In 1988, Congress prohibited smoking on domestic commercial airline flights that were scheduled for 2 hours or less. So what's happening now is that people are starting to recognize smoking is possibly harmful. In 1992, the EPA classifies ETS as a Group A carcinogen, the most dangerous class of cancer-causing materials. And in 1994, Mississippi became the first state to sue the tobacco industry to recover Medicaid costs for tobacco-related illnesses. And other states followed suit, including Florida and Texas and Minnesota. And in November 1998, the tobacco industry approved a 46-state master settlement agreement totaling near $206 billion to be paid through this year. And in 1999, as part of the master settlement, the U.S. tobacco companies agreed to remove all advertising from outdoor and transit billboards. And you know, those of us who were kind of like alive at that time were aware of these things at the time. Do you remember when all the Joe Camel, the Marlboro Man, the Virginia Slims, all of those advertisements just disappeared? In 2000, the U.S. Court of Appeals and the Fourth Circuit Court ruled that interestingly, the FDA lacked jurisdiction under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to regulate tobacco products. You know, as a result of this, you know, the efforts to reduce access of tobacco products to young people, to youth, became invalid. In other words, there were very limited efforts to try to restrict tobacco consumption among young people. So this was a very interesting article. So this, I read this in a journal. Apparently in February 2025, okay, the Attorney General from the New York State Attorney General's office is suing the nation's largest vape distributors for fueling the youth vaping epidemic. If we don't understand the harms of vaping, okay, we can't really educate other people as to why they're harmful, okay? We also can't recognize, if we use these things ourselves, how harmful they can be to us, okay? Now, the amount of nicotine in the vaping formulations, okay, can vary from 6 milligrams per milliliter to 12 to 18 to 24. Some of them also contain what are called nicotine salts to aid in the absorption. The nicotine is also diluted in solutions, okay? These include propylene glycol, glycerol, ethylene glycol, okay? Now, I want you to remember, what I'm telling you are the constituents of the vaping solution. So as you vape, you're consuming not just the nicotine, you're also consuming all of these chemicals. But wait, there's more. You also consume coumarin, okay? Coumarin is akin to Coumadin. And if anyone knows the history of Coumadin or what it is, it's a blood thinner. And does anyone know, I should probably use for Dr. Minicherry, but you know, the origin of warfarin, Coumadin, is rat poison, okay? That's how it kills rats, makes them bleed, okay? That's what you are consuming with a vape. There's also acetamide, formaldehyde. Yes, yikes. Formaldehyde is used to preserve corpses. All right? Acetaldehyde, arsenic, lead, tin, nickel, and chromium. Now, the latter part here, this second column, all of this comes from the elements in the vape pen. Because remember, in order for you to aerosolize that material, the battery is sent to electric charge through a metal filament. And that metal filament will burn. And parts of that filament will end up entering the vaping liquid, which now aerosolizes, and the person will inhale. Now, what are the adverse effects? So first off, nicotine, okay, can harm parts of the brain that control attention, learning, mood, and impulse control. And we've seen somebody that's taking a lot of nicotine or smoking a lot, right? Okay, so there's increased future addiction to other drugs. Remember, I told you nicotine is a highly addicting substance to begin with, all right? So it's almost like, if you're hooked on nicotine, it's almost a gateway to being hooked on other things, all right? I already said nicotine is highly addicted. And the protonated nicotine formulations allow users to inhale a much higher concentration of nicotine than they would otherwise be able to do. Coumarin, as I said, is a vitamin K antagonist, rat poison. It thins your blood. Formaldehyde, again, is a carcinogen. It's a known carcinogen. It's used for preserving bodies. And arsenic, probably if you've ever watched a movie where they tried to poison someone, you know that arsenic is a poison, and the EPA considers it a serious risk to human health. It's an understatement. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is what we call E-Valley. So it's e-cigarette vaping associated lung injury. Since I'm a pulmonologist, I should talk about this. So this was actually recognized as a entity in 2019. And as of 2020, there were 2,800 cases, 68 deaths. 80% of the cases were people who were less than 35 years old. Okay, and 22% had a concomitant asthma diagnosis. Now, what are the pathogens? They're big, big words, okay? These are things that I'd be very familiar with, but you know, these, without going through all of the different pathophysiologies, okay, of these diagnoses, these all can occur just from smoking a vape pen. And we're gonna actually go and look at some images, okay? CAT scans and histopathology tissue sections to show the type of damage. Now, what are the causative agents? THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, this is the active ingredient in marijuana, right? So these are actually can be available in the vaping solutions. Okay, vitamin E acetate is also present in the vaping solutions. Nicotine, obviously. Now, what are the methods, okay, by which one can consume, okay, these solutions? You can get it illicitly, okay, so some kind of black market or off the market source. They are commercially available, which actually to me is it's a hidden danger because they're so readily available. There's so many vape shops that it's almost normalized to use these materials. Some people will actually create some of these things at home, all right? And they're different forms. There's vaping, okay, there's dripping, where the solution is actually dripped on the filament, and then there's dabbing. And there's more, I used to have a sheet that had all the terminology, and I just stopped, because it changes. Now, what are the criteria for evaluating? Okay, you need to be vaping or dabbling in the previous 90 days. There has to be lung imaging that confirms the presence of abnormal changes. You have to exclude a lung infection. So I'm going to tell you that the CAT scans that I'm going to show you, having gone through the pandemic myself and treated patients, they look so similar to COVID lung. So the thing to remember in that is that you get the amount of lung damage with vaping that is similar to what people had with COVID that were hospitalized. Okay? This is why it's important to exclude a lung infection. Okay? And then finally, there has to be an absence of an alternative diagnosis for why this person has these respiratory symptoms. The lungs are a complex organ. I realize that, you know, being a pulmonologist. The purpose of this slide and the video is just to kind of show you, obviously the lungs are located in the chest, it's supposed to loop, okay? And the lungs are comprised of these units called alveoli, these grape-like clusters, okay? Now, the surface of the alveoli, the white area, okay, are very thin membranes, okay? And these thin membranes allow the diffusion or the passage of oxygen and carbon dioxide across them to exchange them into your bloodstream. So when one vapes, okay, the material makes its way through the bronchi, which are the stems of the alveoli, and then eventually into the alveolus itself, okay? Now, it's always good to know what normal is, and this is a normal CAT scan of the chest. So this is a person, they're lying on the scanner bed, and they're being sliced like a piece of bread. Okay, this is what we call an axial view. Now the lungs, which are, let's see, the laser point here. Okay, all right. Okay, be careful pushing that button. So this is the right lung, this is the left lung. This is an important organ called the heart. This is the chest wall here. These are the ribs. See these white, very high intensity white? That's bone, all right? So the important thing to remember is that with a normal lung, the term we use here is parenchyma, the lung tissue. That parenchyma is black. And why is it black? Because I told you, the alveoli they consist of very thin tissue, very thin membranes. So you want your lungs to be filled with oxygen. So anything that's kind of empty or filled with air is going to be black, okay? All right, so this is a patient, okay, with COVID lung. So what are the things to note here? There is these white areas. This is what we call consolidation. You can also see that here, these areas that were supposed to be black, they look almost kind of, you know, like glass, ground glass. That's the term ground glass that we used to describe the CAT scans of patients with COVID. Now, like I said, these areas should be black, and here, these are major airways. This goes to the right lung, what we call the right mainstem bronchus, and the left mainstem bronchus. See how they're filled with air and they're black, okay? Anything that is not black is filled with either fluid or tissue. So this person's lungs, here in the back, are filled with fibrinous material, all right? So they're actually blocking the alveoli, preventing the diffusion of air, okay? And this was a patient who had, this is a 20-year-old who had diffuse alveolar damage and E-valley. She required 2 days of glucocorticoids, or steroids, things like prednisone or solumedrol, okay, to kind of tone down the inflammation before she was able to recover from this. Okay, so here's another image. You can see some areas here, they're black, okay, so these are unaffected lung, but all throughout you see these nodular type of densities here, okay, and this consolidation. So this was another patient who had, again, vaping-related lung injury. They also required glucocorticoids to help tone down the inflammation to allow their lungs to recover. Now this one is a very interesting pattern. So as a pulmonologist, we tend to see this type of pattern all the time. This looks more like what we call a hypersensitivity pneumonitis. What you notice, there aren't a lot of those large areas of consolidation and the big nodules. What you see here is a lot of ground glass. You can also see what's called mosaic attenuation. And what that means is that there are certain areas that have a lot of ground glass and areas that have very little ground glass and tend to form like shapes. We call it, it's almost like a cobblestone type of pathway, okay? You can kind of see here it's a little bit light, then a dark here, then a little bit light here, and then dark here. All this represents inflammation of the lung. Now with hypersensitivity pneumonitis, that's caused, and we see a lot of it actually here in Virginia, because people who work with agriculture, okay, that exposure tends to cause almost, you can think of an allergic reaction in the lungs, all right? And this is how they demonstrate the findings. This is a patient who actually had E-valley, who ended up recovering only after she stopped vaping. So, again, it's almost like a pneumonitic, an exposure to something that reacts with the lung. This one is actually a very interesting one. So, instead of the ground glass infiltrates, what you see here, there's some ground glass, but it's mostly this tissue here, okay, that looks almost like the bone. And then it's mostly here in the periphery. So this is actually what we call fibrosis. So this is actually scarred lung. Scarred lung is irrecoverable, all right? So that means a person with a scarred lung has a reduced capacity for oxygen. Unfortunately, patients who do end up going to their later ages will end up using oxygen. By lung biopsy, this patient actually had a giant cell morphology from the lung biopsy, and that was thought to be due to the chromium that they had inhaled using the vaping pen. Now, this is what we call a slide, okay? So you can take a piece of lung tissue, all right, and actually put it on a microscope slide and examine it, all right? So this is a section of normal lung. So what do we need to know about normal? Like I said, those bubbles, those grape-like clusters, the alveoli, those are these little areas here. You see that? You can almost imagine, it's almost like you took one of those spheres and cut them in half, all right? You took a section through. They're empty, right? Because you expect air to be there. And they're thin-walled because that's how you expect the oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse across the membrane. Now, here's one example, all right? What you see now here, instead of the thin sections, you see actually thickening. And then what you also notice is that inside the areas where the alveoli should be empty, you have cellular material. Some of this is blood, some of it is what we call macrophages. And macrophages are the cells that get activated when something is irritating a particular part of the body. You can see here, what's even worse now is that some of these cells that are kind of encroaching into the alveolar area, some of them have abnormally shaped nuclei. What we call it, the term is atypia, all right? Normally, you know, the body likes to be very organized, so the cells should look somewhat similar, all right? Here, look at the shape of these nuclei. They're all very different. And some of them are also, again, encroaching into the alveolar space. And see these red areas? That's blood. So this person is actually bleeding, too, into their lung. If we take this, you know, even further, magnify it even further, you can look at some of these cells, and you see there's some little brown dots that will come out great here. But if you were to see the actual slide, these dots would be brown. So within the macrophages themselves, in this person with a vaping lung, they are inclusion bodies. So these macrophages are consuming some type of material and encasing them. These particular ones are interesting because this is a stain that they did with Sudan Red O. And Sudan Red O stains fatty materials, okay? So this is actually fatty material, lipoid. It's almost like what we call a lipoid pneumonia, which is a pneumonia in the lung, obviously, that is made up of fatty material. So again, this is the fatty material, the solvents from the vaping solution. And here, when you take a, again, a kind of low power view, you can kind of see how the normal architecture of the lung, or histologically, is very different from the normal. Again, you can see a lot of these, a lot of cellular material. This is inside the airway. This pink is muscle. So your airways have muscles around them, okay, to kind of help them constrict. So here, even within the airway, you have a lot of this material, a lot of these cells that are kind of infiltrating into areas where that should be open. And here, these are what we call foamy macrophages, all right? So now you have these vacuoles that are developing within the macrophages. Again, they're infiltrating the area inside the alveoli. And again, another kind of like, high power view, rather than this being normal lung, look at all of this cellular material here. All right. So another thing that people aren't aware of is that you're actually, when you use a vape device, you're taking an instrument that has a battery in it. And those of us who remember, is it 2016 or 2017, the Samsung phones that were like exploding, you couldn't get on a plane unless you turned your phone off? I don't know if anyone remembers that. I remember because I had a Samsung phone. But, batteries explode. So here's an example of a young gentleman who came in and he was smoking his vape pen and the vape pen blew up on him. The battery exploded. So you can kind of see here, took out his teeth. If you look here, this is a reconstruction of his CT of the skull. He actually fractured his mandible. And you can see a piece of the mandible here was destroyed, okay, from the explosion of the vape pen. Now, obviously you're using a combustible material, so these things will burn. So what we have here is a patient who had a vaping device and an e-cigarette that was actually in their pocket, and it exploded, all right? So you see these burns, okay, on the hand, on the side where, the side where the vape device was located in the pocket, and also here, damage to his leg. So this person also had a vaping device, again, that exploded next to their face. This is what we call traumatic or burn tattooing. That's not coming off, okay, until the skin sloughs off. Here, This person had a burn, again, from a vaping device. And this looks almost like a chemical burn, what we call an alkali burn. All right? All right. So that it scared you enough. Every time I look at that, I'm like, wow, I don't know how anyone would want to vape. And again, the point is it to scare you, sort of, but also for people to kind of understand that, these devices are not benign. The materials in them are not benign, okay? Hopefully by going over the history, you kind of understand there is an undercurrent of trying to market these devices to a certain population, okay, that may not know better, all right? I got 2 daughters, and I'm a pulmonologist, so I tell them everything. I've even showed them this presentation. And I think that, the general public should know. Sometimes when a thing is prevalent, it normalizes that particular item. It normalizes the behavior, all right? We have found, too, even pulmonology, that although e-cigarettes may prove to be, in some patients, a way weaning them off cigarettes, some of us kind of feel that we've robbed Peter to pay Paul, okay? Or maybe even like jumped from the frying pan into the fire. The thing that we have to remember is these materials, this is young. Okay, remember, cigarettes developed cigarettes came to their heyday, were developed in in the 1860s, and it wasn't until the 1970s, right, that they were truly recognized for what they are, all right? We're just beginning with this, 2000. What else are we gonna find over the next 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades?
Good evening, everybody. Can I ask a quick question? Is anybody a former smoker? Can I ask you a question, how hard it was to stop? Oh, please, yeah. So I don't know about you, but I find that smoking has been one of the most challenging addictions for my patients to quit. One of the comments that he made was, it is so highly addictive. I have patients of mine that have stopped cocaine, heroin, marijuana, but they have been unable to stop smoking cigarettes. And some of I hope some of these slides are not going to be redundant. I didn't copy his slides, but there are some of them that are very similar. But you're right, the concentration of the nicotine in these vape pens, devices, et cetera, they're so high. And I think that we are in this kind of time frame where the intent of these devices was to help certain patients wean off of combustible cigarettes, standard cigarettes. But now I think it has been abused, marketed towards a different population. So I'm going to go through some slides. I'm going to go through them pretty fast, especially if I feel like Dr. Golan has gone through, and then we'll go to some questions and hopefully we can knock out some things. All right? I am not technologically savvy. So these are just some pictures of various devices. I have 2 daughters, one in high school, one in middle school, and some of the things as I was preparing for this talk, students and my daughters told me, some of these vape pens, they hide in the bathroom stalls, right? Above the ceiling frames that you can just push up and they hide them. They can come in, they can take a hit, they can, go back to the classroom. They don't smell like cigarettes, but these are how small they are. And you're right, you can fit them in your pocket. They look like flash drives. You can just stick them into your computer, so they're very easily disguisable. So once again, probably started 20 years ago. It is probably in the last 20, 25 years where it's gained a lot of traction. E-cigarettes, e-hookahs, vapes, jewels, tanks, mods, all sizes. Dr. Dolholm is going to talk a little bit about how it works. It is a battery-operated device, and I also was going to talk about some of the facts that it has combusted, exploded, caused trauma to individuals, whether it's in their mouth or other parts of their body. He also talked a little bit about the various molecules. There's a case in here where the first documented case of a patient, and I think it was a teenager, having undergone a double lung transplant because of the damage inflicted by the aerosolized constituents that's in these pens now. That's a very busy slide and very small. So, and this is from a couple of years ago, but as for the CDC, there's been 2,800 cases of lung injury related to e-cigarettes or vaping, 68 deaths, and all these cases are otherwise healthy individuals that develop acute respiratory syndrome. He talked about EVALI, e-cigarettes or vaping-associated lung injury. We have other things that cause lung injury, not only COVID, but other substances, transfusions, but once again, some of the different samples of the fluid. Vitamin E was one of the main additives in the production of cigarettes and vaping and products that has also been known to cause such a horrible reaction. And once again, it could be in one part of the lung, but then it spreads to other parts of the lung just because your body's kind of an inflammatory overload state. And the symptoms are very minor. So it could be coughing, chest pain, shortness of breath, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. So a lot of the same symptoms that somebody could have with the flu. So as we ask people who, vape, why do you do it? Everyone's doing it. Relaxing, social, tastes and smells good, less harmful than cigarettes, or at least that's what it's meant to for people to think. And addiction and peer pressure. And then some people also minimize it, saying that it's only water vapor. Dr. Dolhan made a comment about this as well. I think a lot of the older people in the audience would know this is the Marlboro Man. This is actually heralded as one of the most profound and important advertisements in the history of advertising, and how this changed how cigarettes were sold. So it became very manly, very sexy, and this is Robert Norris, and it's a gentleman who actually never smoked and died at the age of 90. He gave up his role, which he did for about 14 years because he really felt like it was setting a bad example. He was approached by the Marlboro Company to be the Marlboro Man when he was seen, working with John Wayne. But once again, as I said, it was one of the most successful ad campaigns of all time. So they will teach this in advertisement classes in college and business school. Once again, as you can probably imagine, and we think about the targeting of some of these advertisements, right? This ad is not targeted towards adults. This is advertised towards kids, the youth, all right? But once again, these were finally banned because people realized it, but this is how kids start thinking about it. And there was a survey, 1991, that said greater than 90% of 6-year-old kids knew who this was and linked Joe Camel to cigarettes just the way they linked Mickey Mouse to Disney World. Okay? But once again, they knew what they were doing, right? So it becomes normalized. You see it, it's fine, it's okay to do. Juul was another company that did vaping, and he finally, I think in an abundance of guilt, finally said, I'm sorry. And he also feels like he was part of starting this epidemic of younger kids starting to vape. One of the top markets, as you can see, the United States, and then the UK and France and Germany, and then some Asian countries and others. Can you read that? Teen exposure. So 7 out of 10 kids nowadays have done some sort of e-cigarettes or vaping. So now the FDA was trying to get behind this with all the regulations, because now this is becoming an exploding, 78% in 1 year, the amount of growth in e-cigarettes. So once again, about the carcinogenic effects, they found at least 5 carcinogenic compounds in some of the urines tested in teens. Can cause damage to the lining of the lungs, can cause lung damage and respiratory failure. So, and I think a lot of what we're describing contrary to cigarettes, there are some people that will smoke cigarettes, half a pack of cigarettes a day, decades, and a lot of times we'll see the end results of emphysema, COPD, and sometimes lung cancer. We're finding some of these damage not done over decades, but over much shorter durations of time. I apologize about the slide. What you're looking at on the left is a normal, healthy lung tissue. On the right side, it's actually a brownish color, but there are actually these little black dots, and that's just actually tissue necrosis or lung necrosis. That's the death of the lung tissue within that. But what we all want is, we want our lungs to look like the slide on the left side. Inflammation of the lung, this is what I was telling you about. This is from the transplant surgeon that performed this on a 19-year-old child. Double lung transplant. And I couldn't talk eloquently, but somebody undergoing a lung transplant, what is the overall survival? 10 years, maybe 15 years, you're on immune suppressive medications, and then eventually you'll need to undergo another double lung transplant to survive. I mean, these are not usually something that, at 19 years of age, I wonder, can you get to 40, sadly? So it can affect other parts of your body, not just your lungs. It can affect your heart, blood clots, okay? So we see a lot of blood clots. We see blood clots in the legs. They can travel to your lungs. Seizures disorders, neurological symptoms have also been reported since 2019. Can also permanently affect brain function. I think that one of the main things for the kids to know, the younger generation knows, is your brain continues to develop until around age 25. So this is damage that you're doing in a healthy, developing brain. So a couple of the real facts about vaping. So 3/4 of teens who start smoking will smoke for the entirety of their adult life. Not a good statistic. Since 2017, there's been an increase of about 1.3 million more high school students vaping. I think one of the other things I was reflecting on as Dr. Dolhan was talking is, I'm a little bit over 50, and when I think about in the 90s and the early 2000s, we were making a dent in people starting to decrease smoking. As an oncologist, I can tell you that we are definitely seeing less lung cancer than we did before. It's still prevalent, it's not zero, but there are lung cancers that are associated with smoking, and then there are sadly lung cancers that are not associated with smoking. The ones that are associated with smoking, I do see that incidence has decreased. And I attribute that to less smoking. So it's important for the long term, and when we think about kids starting off in their teenage years starting to smoke, it's that same pattern that started another, a former generation, where we started to make progress with the decrease in smoking. Among teens who use e-cigarettes, 30% started smoking traditional or combustible cigarettes within 6 months. I think the other thing, you guys probably know, a lot of the cigarette companies start to buy up the vaping companies, whether it's Juul or, I couldn't tell you, but, and they saw that as a way, because e-cigarettes and vaping was actually definitely more of an expensive habit, right? And with the amount of nicotine that is, people are exposed to, and the high addiction potential, people got addicted so quickly, and then it became cheaper to use combustible cigarettes. So the circle is complete now. They see their sales going down, they see an avenue, they have these e-cigarettes, and then they can come back around to selling their combustible cigarettes again. So this is what a lot of people think about with some of the older tobacco products. Statistics from tobacco. So 5.6 million today. Americans younger than 18 will die early from smoking-related illness. That's about 1 out of every 13 Americans age 17 or younger. That's a lot. 9 out of 10 cigarette smokers first try cigarette smoking by age 18. 98% try smoking by age 26. So once again, I do believe that these companies know they're targeting the youth, and that's where we need to try to make sure we influence our youth to try to stay away. So cigarette smoking is a leading preventable cause of death in the United States. once again, when I think about some of the other more prevalent cancers as well, like breast cancer, colon cancer, and sometimes there may be a genetic risk, but there's not the causality that we have like lung cancer. So it is preventable. Close to 500,000 deaths per year, and that's really 1 out of 5 people that smoke. Once again, it's kind of a similar side to Dr. Dolahan and what's in tobacco products. Tobacco-related illness, we talked a little bit about this as well, from lung cancer to COPD, heart disease and stroke, aneurysms, oral pharyngeal cancers, esophageal cancers. So this is one of the statements I made earlier. There are certain cancers related to tobacco that we're seeing a decrease of. Yes, lung cancer, oral cancers, genitourinary cancers like bladder or kidney cancers. But if this trend reverses, obviously, as you can imagine, these incidences are also going to go up. And I'll kind of conclude on that.